Ukrainian Modernist literature is one of the golden ages of Ukrainian cultural history. In this episode, we'll explore why that is and why the questions raised during this period, spanning the late 19th and early 20th centuries, remain deeply relevant today. You're listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. Explain Ukraine is a podcast by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media outlet focused on Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher and the chief editor of UkraineWorld. My guest today is Rostyslav Semkiv, a Ukrainian literary scholar, associate professor at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and director of the publishing house Smoloskyp. UkraineWorld is run by Internews Ukraine, one of Ukraine's largest media NGOs. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. Your support is crucial as our media increasingly relies on crowdfunding. You can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas where we provide assistance to both soldiers and civilians, mainly by bringing cars for soldiers and books for civilians. You can support our trips via PayPal at ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You will find this link in the description of this episode. This episode is made in partnership with Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the Heritage Ukraine project, supported by the European Union's Erasmus program. So let's begin. Rostyslav Semkiv, welcome to this podcast.
Hello.
Thank you very much for agreeing to talk. So we decided to talk about Ukrainian modernist literature.
Yes.
And Ukrainian literature is a very wide topic. So we discussed the history of Ukrainian literature on this podcast, but we decided to focus primarily on what was happening in the late 19th and primarily the early 20th century, because sometimes for example, the Soviet propaganda, the Russian propaganda is portraying Ukrainian literature as a peasant literature, as a literature provincial, while we have a very deep and interesting modernist turn. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes. First of all, it's important to underline that Ukrainian modernism in literature and also in arts, in other arts, it is quite synchronic with European trends. So we see in the last perhaps quarter of the 19th century the appearance of modernist trends in European art and literature. We can observe there Paul Verlaine and Arthur Rimbaud and so on, Rilke, and even further. And in Ukrainian literature, we have first modernist traits in the 80th of the 19th century. And it is connected with, first of all, with three names, even four names, main names. It is Mikhailo Kotsiubynskyi and Olga Kobylanska. First of all, they are prose writers, and Kotsiubynskyi is combining more older realistic poetics and impressionistic poetics, and he is already quite aesthetical, because that was the main challenge for Ukrainian modernists, early modernists, yes, the choice between the social importance, social problematics, and aestheticism, pure art, and something like this. So, and Kotsiubynskyi is very keen on this aesthetical problematic. Yes, and Olga Kobylanska, first of all, is interested in feministic problematics, and her first books. Her first books are in German. She's German in writing, and she's under the influence of some German writers, women writers. And then she turns to Ukrainian, and so we have two novels, Людина and Tsarivna, and so she's quite interested also in aestheticism and in feminism, because both are about the about life of woman that is going to become independent, that is going to become a writer and achieve the happiness of her own as she saw it. And then we have the most powerful explosion in our literature, because it is because Lesia Ukrainka starts to write, and she is also interested in national problematics, but also very keen on very different modernist movements and mythologism, intellectualism. So we have in her this. It is so-called the dramatic poems. Yes, it is drama poems, big drama poems, and she wrote perhaps at least 15, perhaps of them, and also poetry, also translations. So they were all a kind of a circle, because they, of course, knew each other and conversed with each other, and so they induce this modernist problematics into poetry, prose, and drama. And also we cannot but mention Vasyl Stefanyk. He wrote short prose, and these novelettes, they were very intense, and he's a kind of expressionist. And so this is the very first stage. And then this movement, modernism, developed since the last quarter of 19th century and to the 20th of the 20th century, and it was something like intensification of this movement. In fact, it is a movement with different sub-traits as impressionism, expressionism, then futurism, kinds of surrealism, but then it was then cut in the early 30s, and to some extent we can say imported abroad, because we have after the Second World War we have a huge diaspora, and then many modernist poets and writers, they appeared worldwide. And in the 90th, modernism had something as a return, and we can speak now about both about new modernism in our literature till this time, since the end of the 20th century, and also about postmodernism as a kind of modernist movement to some extent.
Let me just talk a little bit about these four names, because I do think that they are very, very important still now, because in a way we can say that they remained unmatched in the Ukrainian literature.
Yes.
Let me just precise what I mean, because if we take Stefanyk, I don't know whether there are people who really match him in this art of the short novellas, short stories. There are some, of course, great names in the 20th century, but if we take Lesia Ukrainka, frankly speaking, her dramatic poems, as you mentioned, her dramas and tragedies are really, for me, it's the level of the best dramatist in Europe, from Euripides to Shakespeare. If we take Kotsiubynskyi and Kobylanska, this is also the level of the prose. And when I'm trying to explain to myself this, I would say that, look, these people were really caring about the form. Contrary to the next generation that you mentioned, the, let's say, generation of the 1920s, who are very experimental, who did a lot of very interesting avant-garde experiments. But frankly speaking, the 1920s didn't produce such a perfect form, didn't produce a lot of like very, very good novels, let's say. Let's put it this way. What do you think?
For a long time, the chief challenge to Ukrainian literature was the self-protection, the protection of language, the protection of national identity, and through the whole, perhaps 19th century, that was the main aim. and they were not paying much attention to other things as form, for example. Yes, but in the end of the 19th century, they really, I guess that they became conscious that Ukrainian language, Ukrainian identity is quite strong enough, and it can, so the authors can give themselves the chance to make a more wide perspective, can write about a wider scope of things. So, for example, in Lesia Ukrainka dramas, yes, she has ancient Rome and ancient Greece and the East problematics and East images. So some
Scotland,
yes,
America,
Scotland and America,
Troy,
yes,
everything you want,
and many plots from the many things, images from the Bible. So she's very intense in this, and that's a great scale. And she's not telling only about the Ukrainian problematics. Of course, she has different parallels with UK. And everything of this is have parallels in Ukrainian situation of that time. But she is very daring in this. And that's a clear program because she wrote in her letters, yes, that so I have the challenge, I get the challenge to write about Don Juan. Yes, she has this Kamienny Gospodar, stone guest, and
stone host,
stone, yes,
stone master, stone host, yes,
that's the difference. Stone master, and that's a feministic version of Don Juan. And she wrote that I dare to give the Ukrainian version, and they, and she meant Russian critics, yes, they will say, oh, they are so daring, these, not Ukrainians, they said hohols, yes, they are so daring to make this. So that was for her a conscious program to take literature into the more scaled version. And it's true also to Stefanyk and to Kotsiubynskyi. They were all very international, we can say this. They had different contacts abroad. They traveled a lot to Italy, to Switzerland, for example, Lesia Ukrainka. And so they have contacts worldwide. And it was for the first time, because before, through the whole 19th century, it was very concentrated inside Ukraine, around Kyiv, around several points, cultural points. And this is very important to understand that the modernistic stage made possible for Ukrainian literature to become more open to the world. And in fact, they can be very easily compared. For example, Lesia Ukrainka can be easily, to some extent, Kobylanska can be compared to Virginia Woolf, for example. This is the same level, very good educated, very intellectual authors with deep allusions, intertextuality with literature, with European literatures. Not only European literatures, for example, Lesia Ukrainka wrote a kind of a notebook or something like how we can say, a book for her sisters about the history of the East, of the Eastern countries,
You mean the, let's say, or what we call Orient, like,
yes,
right?
Orient.
So
yes.
the Middle East and the Egypt and all this region.
And that is about her the wideness of her interests. So these four. Okay, perhaps with Ivan Franko, but Ivan Franko was a kind of very strongly realistic, and yes, he has a kind of a bit of modernist verses.
I will ask you about him, yeah.
Yes, but in fact he protected this social problematics, realism, and to some extent that he was of the older generation. Elder generation, and so they have some polemics, and also he had with younger modernists, with young muse, Moloda Muza, the group in Lviv. So in fact, these names, they are for this fin de siècle, is the most important for Ukrainian literature. And we have, of course, Shevchenko before, and we have perhaps Khmelyovy and Stus after in the 20th century. But these four, they are the most important names in Ukrainian literature. I think it's quite understandable. I believe I think about this. So I agree with Theodor Adorno and his aesthetic theory, where he says that true art appears in polemic with the previous, strong previous paradigm. So we had this strong national protection paradigm, and in conversation with it, in polemics with it, the high art, I can say this, of Ukrainian literary modernism is born.
What intrigues me about all these names is that if we compare it with the Western modernism, Western European modernism, we can find a very important difference. And I would say that this is a difference that this Ukrainian modernism was actually trying also to work with tradition. We cannot, maybe we can find it, but when we think about like European modernism, okay, you mentioned fin de siècle. When I think about the French figures of the fin de siècle, people like Barbey d'Aurevilly, for example, or then the modernism of the 20th century, people like Proust. When we think about people like Joyce, or you mentioned Virginia Woolf, well, this is very individualistic prose, right? And literature. This is sometimes very transgressive one. This really tests the limits of the aesthetics, of the morality. And of course, we can think about the influences of Nietzsche, etc. While we're thinking about Ukrainians, all of them were also reinventors of tradition. So Kotsiubynskyi wrote the Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. Stefanyk was working very hard on the peasants topic, on the life of peasants, and Lesia Ukrainka is obviously Lisova Pisnya and some other works. So these guys, they were trying to modernize the Ukrainian literature, so looking to the future, but at the same time they were looking in the past. So in a way, they were looking both in the future and the past. They were trying to modernize the discourse by reinventing the tradition and by injecting the tradition into the modernity. What do you think?
Yes, they are less transgressive in comparison to Europeans, of course, because they understand the crucial importance of tradition. Because Ukrainian identity existed just in literature. No state, no institutions to rely on. Even no Ukrainian press or Ukrainian publishing houses, nothing like this. So they have to rely only on literature. And so literature is the core of tradition and of the protection of national identity. That's why they are in dialogue, of course, and it is modernizing. They are less avant-garde true avant-garde appeared in the beginning of the 20th century, in the 20s, like Semenko, futurists. So it is, they are more polite with the tradition, and we even have a different, for example, there are different stories about the arguments between Franko and this young muse, Młoda Muza poets, and on the paper they clashed and they quarreled with each other, but then Ivan Franko sends a postcard for the wedding of one of them, of Staplutsky, and so
it's like today.
Yes, so it is something more polite. And yes, for example, Joyce, he is also within this quarrel with the tradition, but he's very critical towards Ireland, Irish nationalism, Irish everything, because, and he was to some extent even neglected for this at the time. So yes, he is very individualistic, and he opposed to this, though everything he wrote is about Ireland, is about Dublin, about almost everything, some examples just about other things, but in fact he is very against this true national spirit. It is something quite suspicious to him, though of course that doesn't mean that he turned and became English. No, he is Irish, but he's constantly in opposition, even in the most, because Lesia Ukrainka was quite resolute to this, so she was quite strong in her opposition to all the understandings, all the tradition, but in fact, so it is also the dialogue of mother and daughter, because her mother, Olena Pchilka, she was also a writer, and not so bad writer, if we think one of the best there in the end of the 19th century, but of more traditional understanding of literature. So that was also the clash of generations. But yes, they were more attentive to the tradition, of course.
Because it's a very interesting. I'm wondering whether it's not a specific approach to time, to history, which characterizes Ukrainians, but also maybe lots of other nations who, as you said, didn't have a state, because the state clearly institutionalized this modernization. While for nations like Ukraine, basically, when you look upon the future, when you look into the future, you are actually asking, so maybe the future lies in the way how we take the tradition which is buried under this earth by, let's say, imperial power. So, and we reinvent it because it's, as Kotsiubynskyi says, forgotten ancestors. So we rather start remembering these forgotten ancestors. Another problematics, which I think is very important for the modernists, is the conflict between an individual and a community. I see it also everywhere. I see it in Stefanyk, I see it in Lesia Ukrainka, for example, in dramas like Rufina and Priscilla, in dramas like Advokat Marcian, Cassandra, obviously.
Upuści, yes.
Upuści. So lots of, because modernist program is to emancipate the individual, right? But at the same time, individual is part of the community which is endangered. So he or she feels also the necessity to protect the community, but sometimes this endangered community is oppressive. It's clearly seen at Advokat Marcian is probably the best example. And then individual is kind of in a contradiction what to do. Either you protect your community and renounce from your own freedom, or you protect your community and your own freedom. We can say also that the Kotsiubynskyi writes a lot about this. And I do think this is a very interesting philosophical problem, not only the aesthetic problem. And I do think that, for example, in more relaxed societies that can afford this kind of a high extreme individualism, this problem is not fully reflected upon, while we clearly see it today during the war. Like, what is more important, the individual freedom or sacrifice to the community, right? And you mentioned Franko. I think it's clearly that in the Moïse, the Moses of Franko, this is a clear conflict between a leader and his community, right? So we see the same problematics actually in him.
Yes, because for Franko, it is understandable that community is not so developed as he wanted to, but it is not the ground for opposition and for some clash, but that's a ground for kind of elegious attitude, yes, and he's truly sad that it is something like this. But in the end of his poem, this big poem, Moses may say, there is in last stanzas. He has this firm belief that in future this herd of people, yes, they will become the true society of warriors, and they will overcome. So he has this future belief, and it is his very strong motif through the whole of his life, of his writings, from Kamenyari, stonebreakers, and to Moses. But while in Kamenyari they don't have a leader, but only a voice from above. The God tells them, go forward and ruin these walls. And in the end, they already have this leader, Moses, a poet and a writer, and so they can move on to their aim. And of course, for Lesia Ukrainka, it is always the conflict, because also she understands that they should have the rebel, the chief rebel that will rise everyone to the rebellion, and the motive of rebellion, it is very constant to her, so she imagines it once and once again, from Robert Bruce, the King of Scotland, and to the end, to Orgia, one of her last dramas. And so that's the first of all the rebel, then the leader, and so the bright individual. Though she is somehow skeptical towards Nietzsche, but in her letters, but in fact, it is very strong. I don't know that the intertextuality was his philosophy. So I guess yes, this is very important conflict, and it is very modernist, yes, in its essence.
How would you assess the feminine and the feminist element in the modernism? Because you mentioned the four names, two of them are women. And I always say that this is my personal, very subjective, of course, estimation that the greatest Ukrainian writer is a woman, Lesia Ukrainka. Obviously, the feminism did not start with the modernism because we have personalities before. We have Marko Ovchok, we have... you mentioned Olena Pchilka, we have Hanna Barvinok, we have some other names. But what exactly these names, Kobylanska and Lesia Ukrainka, bring to the Ukrainian society?
So the first move in this, where Ukrainian feminism in literature became very vivid, it is Pershий Вінок, the collection of the anthology of women writers, It appeared already in 1887, and it was organized by the generation of the elder, somehow elder generation, Olena Pchilka, Natalia Kobrynska. So there were a group of dozen and more women, perhaps 17 of them. Yes, they gathered different literary pieces, and they published this very interesting book. It is just now republished already in our contemporary moment. And that was a very strong manifestation that, yes, there are a number of women who write, and their voices are already quite audible. And in fact, Lesia Ukrainka already appeared there as a young writer, but it is the next generation, and this time Kobylanska and Lesia Ukrainka, they are really strong writers, because in this collection, Перший вінок, they are not so very, in fact, in the beginning of this collection, Olena Pchilka published her verse where she said that, okay, critics, stay just away. We are now making our own collection, not to compete for any, but just to show that we are present, and we have this future. And they organized a number of women organizations then already in the end of the 19th century, and so that was also the beginning of the institutional presence of women in literature and in cultural life. Because yes, we had some of women before, but it is quite a symbolic thing that Markova Ovchok, Maria Wilinska, yes, she took man's pseudonym, yes,
like many others.
Yeah, yes, like many others,
like the Bronte sisters, and
and
George Sand.
But then, from the end of the 19th century, we have very powerful presence of women in literature. It was not so in the 20th in the Ukraine, in the Soviet Union. There are just a few women there. But in all groups abroad, in Prague poetic group, and then in New York group, the presence of women already very vivid. So that's very also one of programmatic things in Ukrainian modernism, and even those who are perhaps not so modernistic as Ivan Franko, he also has a kind of feministic visions in his writings.
By the way, you mentioned that, and I just thought, look, the canon that we have about the next generation, the executed Renaissance, is mostly male canon. And I think someone told me, I didn't verify it, but maybe you will correct me, that in the first anthology of Yuri Lavrinenko about the executed Renaissance, there were only men. Is it true?
Yeah, because there were several women quite bright, and Raisa Troyanker, and Natalia Zabila, and Lesia Mogilyanska. So there were a few of them, but they were not on the first roles. And in fact, they collapsed to more traditional topics, traditionally it's stereotype, but yes. So Natalia Zabila became a writer for children. She started to write, and she is known just like a writer for children. Then Raisa Troyankar had these erotic poems. No more serious topics, though. We had Zinaida Tulub then, and she wrote our first, perhaps not first, but quite big historical novel, Ludolove, People Catchers, something like this. It's about the 17th century. But she was arrested very soon after and spent 15 years in Stalin's camps. So it was impossible for her to write further, though she wrote when she returned, but it was not so strong. So in fact, it was not very very characteristic voice of women in the 20s in Ukraine under Soviet Union.
Yeah, so it's remarkable that the stereotype that Soviet Union brought more rights to women, actually, in this particular case of the Ukrainian literature of 1920s, 1930s, is not verified, contrary to the period of even of the Russian Empire.
Yes, but we in fact don't see many Soviet women writers. Just a few of them, and it was a general stereotype, whether this Spilka Pismennikів, yes, Writers' Union, there were mainly men.
We have Irina Vilde, like
Irina Vilde, yes, but it is the 30s in Галичина, in the west of Ukraine, where the situation was somehow other, and there were a number of women there quite bright, as Sofia Jablonska, though she emigrated, and for example, then further Natalia Levitska-Holodna and Olena Teliga. So there were women which were more active and more seen on this in this literary circle. So it is perhaps a contradiction, but in fact, yes, this Writers' Union of the Soviet Union that was mainly men united, and when in the early 60s. Even in the early 60s of the 20th century already. Then the Shevchenko Prize, the chief till this time art prize in Ukraine, in cinema, in arts, in music, and in literature, when they started this Shevchenko Prize in the early 60s, then since that time and to the end of the 20th century, and even perhaps further, I especially counted there were something like 100 men that won this prize and only 10 or 11 women. So it was the ratio was something like this.
Yeah, so the emancipated image of the Soviet women is exaggerated. So truly, they were not considered as a family people, right? Yeah. In this traditional concept of the family, like you sit with your kids and you take care of the household. They were, of course, brought to factories. So we have this image of the working woman or to the fields, but whether they had access to the creative professions, that's a big question.
That's very clear illustration of something of what Marcuse wrote. They were just the productive units. This production in the factories, production of children, that is something very totalitarian in its essence.
Let me come back to our characters now, our writers, the modernist writers. And what would you advise to read to the foreign public? What is translated? For example, for me personally, I think that Stefanyk although he writes in a very specific language, specific version of the Ukrainian language. But if he's properly translated, he's probably the best introduction into the Ukrainian literature in general, because they're very powerful, very short stories, something just 1 page, 2 pages. And it's like it makes a huge emotional impact on the reader. Obviously, I'm thinking about Lesia Ukrainka's dramas, but it's quite difficult to translate it because of the poetic nature and everything. I hope it will be done fully in the future. What is your estimation?
Well, Lesia Ukrainka is translated. Many of her dramas are translated, but it's a question of the quality of these translations, because they were mainly done not by so professional translators, and so yes, we need the new translations of her dramas into different languages, but it is quite complicated to do this because of her. I have a story from life, and it is quite funny. One of my friends, he decided to translate Lisova Pisnya, yes, the forest song, and he translated just the first page, the list of characters, and when he came to Poterchata, he collapsed because he didn't see the possibility to translate these mythological creatures, different mythological creatures.
Poterchata are children who were drowned and unbaptized, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, yeah? So he went searching for the perhaps the similar images in other folklores, and there he stopped. Yes, but in fact, it is, of course, possible to translate, and in future it should be so. I would say that 3 of them, yes, Lesia Ukrainka and yes, Stefanyk, but also Kotsiubynskyi, because Kotsiubynskyi here also brilliantly works with these short forms, and they are quite interesting in different aspects of their problematics. For example, he has Crimea cycle. He has Bessarabian cycle. This is cycles of several stories, and in fact, he was the first that observed this culture of Crimean Tatars, and it is quite important because we are neighbors, and we were neighbors since quite a long time, though there were clashes in history, but there, in the end of the 19th century, he wrote a number of short stories about Crimean Tatars.
Same with Lesia Ukrainka, for her, yes. Crimea was very important.
Yes, and he had about the Moldavans and Bessarabian people, and about Jews. He has also a number of images of them. So he's quite diverse in his problematics and very, very aesthetical. So he writes very gently and very, very dense with different feelings, with what you can see and listen to and smell and something. He's very intense in this case. And Stefanyk is very strong. He is very emotional, very suggestive, and so yes, they are very interesting. But this genre of short story, it is quite important for the whole Ukrainian literature, because you need you need a deal of time to write a big novel. And in fact, it was not the case of our writers. And you have to organize a publishing house for which is possible to publish a big novel. So they were masters of a short story, And also there, further in the 20th century, for example, Volodymyr Yermolenko, very strong short stories, so he had novels, of course. And further to Grigir Tutunik, they are very interesting. So yes, I agree that we should start, if we want to understand Ukrainian literature, then we should start from short forms, short prose, and we would find a great number of different topics, different images. It is perhaps the best way. Though, of course, poetry is the best way, but poetry, it's a challenge to translate. And our best poets like Yevhen Pluzhnik or Volodymyr Svidzinski in the 20th century, and further Vasyl Stefanyk, Grigory Chubay, they are quite sophisticated and complicated in form. But yes, in future it should be all translated.
Let me remind to our listeners that Kotsiubynskyi, The Shadows of the Forgotten Ancestors, was made into cinema with the great movie by Serhiy Parajanov, one of the chefs-d'oeuvres of probably the world cinema. Maybe the last question, when you localize this modernism, Ukrainian modernism in the greater Ukrainian tradition, how would you define it? Because I will give you my response first. For me, this is the golden age. Because I do appreciate the next generations like the Executive Renaissance, and we talked about this a little bit, but they were experimenters, and some of them produced also great novels like Kyiv-Mohyla or like Yanovsky. Some of them produced great novels because they emigrated, like Bahariani. But this feeling of the form was given by the modernists, and the avant-gardists tried to break this form, but generally when we come out and we look upon this from today's perspective, this is my very subjective feeling, I really appreciate the efforts to destroy the form, but I appreciate much more the efforts to build the form. And as I said, this attention to the form, this attention to the conflict between individual and community, endangered community, and this work with modernization and tradition, this very specific philosophy of time and history, is something that makes this generation probably unmatched. But what is your estimation?
Yes, I also agree that this fin de siècle, the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th, is the peak of the whole Ukrainian literature. We had very powerful Baroque literature before, but it was to some extent narrow. Though we had great big number of authors there, but it was a kind of narrow. It was narrowed by. It was not. So it was religious, almost totally religious, and that's why it hadn't this the whole scope of genres and so on. And in the 20th century, during the 20th century, of course, there were strong authors, but not so strong as these named by us. And so that's perhaps the climax. But we know that in a story we can have several climaxes, so we can wait for the next one. If we take quantitatively, so in the numbers, then of course just now it is the time that there is the most great number of Ukrainian books ever published. Now it is very our publishing industry is quite strong. It's already a very productive and profitable business. So we have many books now and many writers, so many writers, Ukrainian men writers, women writers, which we never had before. But I'm not sure that someone will dare to compare someone from our contemporary literature with those Stefanyk and Kotsiubynskyi, Kobylanska, and Lesia Ukrainka. But we can wait that in this strong community of writers that now exist, in future or even in the nearest future, we'll see very great names and great books.
I will just slightly disagree. I think if we talk about some of the names of contemporary writers, we can definitely say that Jadán or Kalitko or the young ones like Artur Droň probably are matching the greatest poets.
Okay, Oksana Zabushko is still writing also.
Yeah, Oksana Zabushko is also one of the great thinkers and novelists and poets. So we can keep on thinking, probably Lina Kostenko and Izdrik and many others. But of course, there is still very big discussion about the big novels, etc. So for big novels, you need time, you need patience, you need calmness, which is very difficult to get during the war. Although we have already very good novels, and probably it will be one of the other topics to talk about. Rostyslav Semkiv, thank you so much for this conversation. This was a podcast Explain Ukraine by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media outlet about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher and the chief editor of UkraineWorld, and also the president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was Rostyslav Semkiv, a Ukrainian literary scholar, associate professor at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and director of the publishing house Smoloskyp. UkraineWorld is run by Internews Ukraine, one of Ukraine's largest media NGOs. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. We buy a lot of cars for Ukrainian soldiers and bring a lot of books for Ukrainian libraries on the frontline territories. And let me remind you that this episode is made in partnership with Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the Heritage Ukraine project, supported by the European Union's Erasmus program. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.